Okay, so I always feel like I have to apologize a little bit in advance for this class period. It's probably one of the most boring 50 minutes of the rest of your life. I'll try to make it as interesting as possible. Yesterday we talked about plagiarism. We talked about how easy it is to commit plagiarism accidentally, in part because you're not applying the MLA documentation requirements with attention to detail. With the exception of 2 students that we looked at last class period in those examples, all of those students committed plagiarism accidentally. They had good intentions, they just slipped up in some aspect of MLA documentation and it cost them dearly. So what we're going to do today is go over some of those MLA details, make sure you understand how MLA works, why it works the way it works, and sort of go through another one of my favorite little driving analogies or metaphors for how to get it in your mind, all the steps necessary anytime you're using a source, okay? So the first thing I want to do is talk a little bit about how we got to the MLA system. So I put on the board the footnote system for documentation, which we will not be using, okay? But it's important to understand a few things about it to understand the logic of the MLA system. So the footnote system would have you, after you've used a source, insert a superscript numeral, and then have a corresponding numeral with the full bibliographic information on the last pages of the document. This is called the endnote system, actually. Footnotes would technically have them at the bottom of the page. So actually, let me go ahead and change that. We'll call it endnote system. You don't get too confused. But the logic here is that anytime you use a source, you have a number, you have a corresponding number, and it's on the endnote page where we find out what page you're citing, who the person is, perhaps, that you're citing. And the logic of this system was that it makes for very efficient reading. You don't have a lot of documentation stuff gumming up the text while you're reading, right? It's easy to skate over a numeral, and if you really care who is being cited in number 1 or number 2, you can go look. But you don't have to, right? And you're not distracted by citation. The problem with this system, there were a couple of problems. One is that in the absence of a signal phrase, you wouldn't even know who was being cited, right? So let's say you're writing a paper about child development, and you're citing Abraham Maslow. We don't know you're citing Abraham Maslow unless we go back here and look it up. You might be citing, oh, I don't know, Ricky Lake or somebody like that, right? Does Ricky Lake even exist anymore? Yeah. You might be citing, you know, Montel Williams or something. So these are not people who have immediate credibility on these topics. Abraham Maslow does, right? So the one disadvantage is that we don't get as much information about the credibility of your sources in the text of the research paper when you're using endnotes. The other disadvantage was that if you wanted to revise, it created a lot of havoc. Let's say, for example, that you were writing a research paper, and let's say this is page 2 of your research paper, and your teacher said, I really think that you should move these you should switch the order of these 2 paragraphs. You should move your 3rd paragraph up to where your 2nd one is. Well, before the days of computers, if you were to cut this and paste it up here, you would have to retype every single one of your superscript numerals. They did not automatically reorganize themselves, okay? So nobody ever wanted to revise anything or add anything to the first half of their document because every other page in your paper had to be revised in a corresponding fashion to make sure the numbers stayed in the right order, right? Today, Microsoft Word, any word processing program actually does this for us automatically. But nonetheless, that was an issue. Another issue was it was very wasteful of paper. And you might think, well, how can numerals take up more space than names and page numbers? Well, every time you used a source, you had to have a line in the endnotes corresponding to it. So let's say we use Chow here in the first one. We use Chow again. What we'd have is a little thing that says, I can't remember now whether it's IBID or OPSIT. I think it's IBID, which means same author, different page number. and then you use another source, you'd have the full bibliographic information. Let's say you used this source here, footnote number 3, 8 times in your paper. You would have 8 footnotes associated with it in your endnote sheet. You could have 4 or 5 pages as your endnotes, and multiple pages would have nothing more than a single numeral and the word ibid, 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 ibid page 6, ibid page 9, ibid page 12, right? And it was just kind of wasteful, right? So for the most part, we still have this system, and there are still documentation expectations occasionally that ask for footnotes or endnotes. But for the most part, we've moved away from that. APA and MLA both use an in-text parenthetical and works cited model instead. And it has a number of advantages. One is if Abraham Maslow or David Chow is a renowned expert on something, we know it right here. If I'm writing about cigarette smoking and cancer, and I cite Koop, you know it's C. Everett Koop, former Surgeon General of the United States, and you know that this is a physician that I'm citing, even if it's not included in the signal phrase, which typically it would be. But the other advantage is that I can move things anywhere and not have to reorganize my entire paper and my entire works cited. It doesn't matter whether I use Chow before Jones or Jones before Chow. They will always be in alphabetical order in the bibliography, in the works cited, right? And I can use Jones 57 times in my paper. I don't recommend that. It's probably overusing one source. But I could use Jones 6 times in my paper, and I still only have to have her once in my bibliography, right? So it saves paper. It gives us a little bit more information while we're reading the paper, and we can revise with a little bit more ease. Now there is one catch to this. So, and we'll talk about when you need to give the author's name and when you don't. But let's say I decide that I want to move the second part of my Chow discussion down. I had Chow, page 4. I'm also citing Chow, page 6. But because it's consecutive, I don't need to use the author's name again. If I decide to move Chow down, the second reference to Chow down below my reference to Jones, I need to put Chow's name in again. So the numeral 6 is no longer going to be sufficient. I have to integrate Chow and 6 down here. So otherwise, if I put 6 here, we're going to assume it's Jones, page 6, right? So that's the only thing that makes revision and reorganization of your paper a little bit tricky. You just have to make sure that you use the author's name preceding the integration of the in-text citation. Yeah, Doug?
If you were to copy and paste, or cut and paste that and put it at the bottom of the paper, but accidentally forgot to put Chow's name before the page number, so you would think of Jones, would that be another form of accidental plagiarism?
That's not really considered plagiarism. That's considered a documentation error. You know what I mean? And there's a slight difference. So with plagiarism, you're passing something off as your own, or you're passing something off as being original or new or whatever, and it's not. When, let's say, for example, that you did, well, I like your example. I don't need to think of a different one. So let's say we move this all the way down to the end, and we don't put Jones. Probably at a rough draft stage, I would, and any teacher would say, is this Jones or was this Chow? Just because the page numbers make me think, I don't know. Jones's article is on page 26 to 38. I don't think there's a page 6 in an article that falls on pages 26 to 38. So I would probably think, is this still Jones or is this Chow? So it's confusing documentation and a failure to follow all those rules, but it wouldn't be typically, at least, and it wouldn't be in my class, an F kind of proposition, right? So that's the bottom line. I said it wouldn't be an F, and everyone's like, whew, nodding, right? Okay, so the other thing is, so I can reorganize these, and I don't have to reorganize the works cited. I can cite each author as many times as I want, and I don't have to have multiple works cited entries. If I have multiple articles by Chow, then I would have multiple entries for Chow, but I don't need multiple entries for a single source by Chow if I use it multiple times. So the beauty of this is that it's alphabetical. It's not ordinal, Okay, ordinal makes things a little bit more complicated. Typically, works cited pages in an English 102 paper are about 2 pages long. So that's not nearly as bad as the length they could be if you were using endnotes. I'm trying to think if there's anything else that I want to describe about this. Questions about any of it? Yeah.
If you have 2 different sources with the same last name, would you just put like the first letter and the first name?
Yeah. So there are a couple of other things. Let's say you have 2 authors with the same last name, or you have 2 sources by the same author. Let's say we have another thing by Chow. Okay, we would so Chow has. Let's say this is Chow 2. It's kind of weird. When you have 2 things by the same author, you don't put their name a second time in the works cited. You put 3 hyphens and a period. But what we would do here is we would have to give a short version of the title. So we would have Chow, quote, Tiger, page 6. And down here, we would have Chow, Sports, page, what did I say, 26? Okay, so that would distinguish between those. Now with authors with the same last name, let's double check. So if you look on page 458 in our book, it's on page 480, it's example number 9 on page 458, which is on page 484. I can never remember whether it's the whole name or initial. I think it's just the initial. Ah, okay. It is an initial, and it goes before. So let's say we had 2 Chows. Maybe it's a husband and wife team that wrote separately. We have B Chow, and we have D Chow. And now, because they are different authors, right, we don't actually need the title. One is B Chow, one is D Chow. And it would look like that. Make sense? Here's the key, and I'm glad you asked that question. Just as the Roman numeral, or excuse me, not the Roman numeral, the numeral 1 in an endnote has to match unambiguously with the numeral 1 in the endnotes, the name needs to match unambiguously with the name back here in the works cited. It has to be an exact relationship. It doesn't mean it has to be Chow David in here, right? But we need to see Chow, right? Let's say you were thinking of this article as your Sports Illustrated article. And you said Sports Illustrated, page 6. We are not going to be able to scan down the left edge of your works cited and find under the letter S this article. You see that? Could we go like this and read through and try to figure it out? Yeah, but we're not supposed to have to do that. The reason the hanging indent exists, the reason the first 5 letters hang over, is so you can scan down the left edge and find the article like that, alphabetically. Okay? So let's say this was Jones again. Okay, if we had 2 pages of this in particular, right? If you have 2 sources, having Sports Illustrated, it's not correct MLA documentation, but your reader's not going to have a hard time finding it. It's going to be one of these 2 sources. Which one's the one from Sports Illustrated? But if you have 2 pages of these, your reader's not supposed to have to go like this. Plus, you might have more than one article from Sports Illustrated. If you're writing about Tiger and celebrity scandals and what sports do to major sports figures in terms of the expectations placed on them and the expectations they have for what they deserve, right? You're going to have probably more than one article from Sports Illustrated. Or you're going to have multiple articles from periodicals that have the word sports in their title, right? What's most specific and most needed, both in the signal phrase and in the in-text citation, is the author name, because that is more unique, right? Now let's say you have a source that doesn't have an author. Turns out David Chow was interviewed in this article. He didn't actually write it. The article has no author, as is not uncommon in newspapers and sometimes magazines. Again, we're not going to call it Sports Illustrated. We're going to call this article by its title, which is Tiger Comes Back, in quotation marks, page 6. Okay. Now, alphabetically, it's going to be under T for Tiger, right? It's not going to be under S for Sports Illustrated. It's not going to be under A for Anonymous. It's going to be under T for Tiger. So, yeah.
In the citation, can't you just write a simplified version of the title, like just Tiger?
You could. You can write a shortened and simplified version of the title. It is possible that with it being somebody's name, you might have more than one article, so you have to have enough words in the title to distinguish it from any other article you might use. Typically, we consider 2 to 3 words to be sufficient, so you don't need to reduce it to simply one word. But if you wanted to do Tiger 6, you could do that.
So
Yeah, no, go ahead.
okay, and since it's an article, it's in print. I mean, it's in quotation marks. But if it was like the title of a book, would it be italics?
Italics, yeah, and because there's no real way for me to handwrite italics, I underline them. So underlining symbolizes italics in handwriting. But yes, so Sports Illustrated would be italicized. The article title is in quotation marks. And that's one of the things that we'll see too when we dip into the book here in a minute, that you always put the smaller thing in quotation marks and the larger thing in which it is found in italics. So it is an article from a magazine or an article from a scholarly journal. Similarly, a song from a CD. Okay, CD title would be italicized, song would be in quotation marks, poem in quotation marks, the anthology would be italicized. A particular episode of a television show, the episode title in quotation marks, the title of the show italicized. And that's sort of routine across all media. So a page of a particular website, right? So let's say we go to sportsillustrated.com and we read the article Tiger Strikes Back or Comes Back. That page is in quotation marks, but sportsillustrated.com is italicized. Okay. Yeah.
About this works cited, do we add the date of when we found the article?
Yes, so notice, because I wanted to fit this up here and keep things simple, both of these are print sources. Do you know what it means for a source to be a print source? It doesn't mean that you went to a website and hit print, right? It means it's actually created by its publisher or manufacturer in a print form. So this is a print source. If you got it online, it would be a web-based source. And so we're going to look at all of those details in a minute, but I didn't want to bog this down with that much information. Yeah.
What did you say when there was an author that maybe you used twice in there? Did you used to put lines up there for a second entry?
So, yeah. So if you are using 2 different sources by the same author, then in the works cited page, you put those 3 hyphens.
Mm-hmm. Oh, they're hyphens?
Yeah, they're hyphens. So this is, you wouldn't do this with an article without an author because obviously that would, they wouldn't have the same exact title typically. But let's see, so this is Chow, David. So what you would have here for the second article by the same author is the 3 hyphens. What you would have here is Chow Tiger in quotation marks and Chow Sports in quotation marks. Now that is when you have two different sources by the same author, not when you've used an author more than once, right? So if you've used an author more than once, but it's just one source, he or she's only here once, doesn't matter. And then that affects more what goes in the parentheses. All right, let's dig a little more deeply into each of these parts because I can feel that you guys are starting to head that way anyway. So basically, anytime you're using any source, and again, whether you're summarizing it, paraphrasing it, or quoting it, you have to apply the documentation requirements, right? And the documentation system in MLA has 4 different parts. First part is the signal phrase. Let me go ahead and write an example of that. According to David Chow, comma. Okay? That's an example of a signal phrase. Another example might be one author says. Okay? Notice the author's not named there, and we'll get to that one in a second. But those are examples of signal phrases. The other part you need is quotation marks, if necessary. So you have to ask yourself, am I summarizing or paraphrasing, or am I now quoting? And if you're quoting, you use quotation marks, which would be these things with author's language. Whatever the author is actually saying, word for word, that would go in quotation marks. Then you have an in-text or parenthetical citation. Actually, let me reverse the order. Right? The in-text parenthetical citation gives the page number on which that information can be found. And you give the page number, again, whether you're summarizing, paraphrasing, or quoting. I've also had students say that, you know, if you're just summarizing, you don't need to give a page number. You only have to give a page number if you're quoting. But that's not actually accurate. Did you spill something?
No,
Okay. So, for example, if you said, according to David Chow, and you summarized or paraphrased something, you'd have page 6. If you said one author says, and you summarized or paraphrased something or quoted it, but you didn't use the author's name in that signal phrase, then the name has to be in the signal phrase here. So whether the name goes in the signal phrase or not depends on whether the name, or excuse me, whether the name goes in the parenthetical citation or not depends on whether the name is in the signal phrase or not. Right? And then there's the works cited entry, and that's where you have the full bibliographic information for your source. And that's where you would have the medium, right? Like whether it's web-based or not, whether you got it from ProQuest, etc. So these 4 things, and you know, I told you I have a little driving analogy, and you know I like driving in car analogies. So I like to think of this as being a little bit like driving down the road and deciding you're going to pass somebody. So if you're driving down Highway 14, and you're in the slow lane, and people are going 52, which is what they do in the 60-mile-an-hour zone on Highway 14. They're going 52, and you decide you're going to pass, right? Theoretically, if you're following the rules, which we will do, right, you first put on your signal, right? You get into the left lane, right? You pass that person, and then when you're done, you put on your signal and you get back over, which is kind of like your in-text citation, okay? So these 3 parts are a little bit like passing someone on the highway. And let's say you're passing them really, really fast. So you've got quotation marks around your car. Okay, this is when the analogy breaks down just a little bit. But you're writing. You're plodding along at 52 miles an hour. You found the perfect source. You're going to use it. It speeds you up through the end of this paragraph, right? Because you're going to quote. You put on your turn signal, according to David Chow. You're quoting David Chow, so you're flying and passing at 70 miles an hour with quotation marks around your car, right? And then you're done passing, you got your quotation marks ending, and you have Chow's name signaling you're done using that author, okay? And then you continue on. So anytime you use a source, summarizing, paraphrasing, quoting, have it in your mind, almost physically feel it. I'm about to use another source, signal. Left hand, your left hand should think, signal, right? Accelerate, get through that source. When you're done, make sure you've thought about how fast you're passing, whether you need quotation marks. Include your parenthetical citation that you're done. You're back in the slow lane, going 60 now because that's what you should do in a 60-mile-an-hour zone. And then when you get to your destination, you put your works cited entry. Okay? Make sense? Sound easy? Kind of. Deceptively so, doesn't it? So let's look at some of the variations on this. Questions about this, first of all, before we get to the variations. So if you look at page 458 to 459 in your book, and Jackson, could I get you to turn off, I think it's the left, yeah, let's try that one. Oh, no, let's do the other one. There we go, perfect, thanks. You've got these shaded blue directories to all the MLA in-text variations and all the works cited models. So this sounds pretty easy, right? Anytime I'm using a source, signal, quotation marks if necessary, and quotation marks, in-text citation, I'm done. Make sure I put the corresponding information in the works cited. But you'll notice there are 27 variations on how that in-text citation might look. The good news is you're not going to use most of them. You're probably going to use 1 through 4, 6 through 10, 16, and 23. And if you wanted to go ahead and just circle those as your first places to zero in, just so that you're not overwhelmed later in the quarter, you're more than welcome to do that. If the author's named in a signal phrase, there's one way you handle it. If the author's not named in the signal phrase and is going to be named in the parentheses, there's another way you handle it. If the author's unknown, if the page number is unknown, there's a different way of handling it. 2 or more authors, 4 or more authors, organization. We'll talk about anthologies tomorrow. How many of you know what an anthology is? Yeah. What is it, Madison?
An anthology is a collection of books.
Excellent, a collection of works. And typically it's a collection of works by different people. So when you have a selection from an anthology, the name on the spine of the book may not be the author of the actual selection you're using, right? Imagine a greatest hits album. It's like multiple artists. Like you buy it online. It's 70s soul or something like that. And it's got 115 songs by different artists, right? You can't simply say that this is an album by R&B Incorporated, right? If you are using a song by the Shy-Lights, you got to say Shy-Lights because there are songs by a bunch of different artists on that CD. Same thing when you're looking at a book that has multiple authors in it. That's a little different from a magazine that has different authors in it, even though they might look similar. And I'll show you some examples of both of those tomorrow. So there are a bunch of variations here. And what you need to do anytime you're using a source is say, okay, how am I going to handle that in-text citation? Notice it depends a little bit on how you handle the signal phrase. And so we'll look at that in a second too. There's some good examples in the book on that. Then also, there's a directory to MLA works cited entries. And there are 86 variations on that. So here's the one trick with MLA. When you're integrating a source, you need to have in your signal phrase and or your parenthetical citation the piece of information that comes first in your works cited entry. What is usually the last thing you work on when you're writing a research paper? The works cited page. What do you need to know when you're using a source from it? What's going to be in that works cited page? one little glitch in there, but the good news is it's always one of two things. It's the author if there is one, or if there isn't, it's the article title, right? Or organization, etc. There's some other variations, but for the most part, in your cases, it's going to be author name or article title. So let's look at a few of these things let's get over here. Signal phrases for integrating sources. We'll go through it step by step, our four-step process here. This is page 473. Might be a worthy page to sort of flag in your book. It has a lot of different verbs to choose from. In the words of researchers Greenfield and Davis, as legal scholar Kaysen has noticed, such and such, writes Daniel Tynan, and continues. So there are lots of variations to kind of mix it up. So it's not always according to so-and-so, according to Chow, according to Jones. Right? So you've got variations on the verbs. You can say acknowledges, agrees, argues, insists, endorses, right? And they send different signals. Remember how we were talking about the potential to suggest some bias in the process of quoting, right? You can use verbs to do that. That's the best way of doing that. So we have some examples of signal phrases. You use the signal phrases to mark boundaries. Remember yesterday we had that one national park example where the student was using that source for 2 or 3 paragraphs before even using the author's name. At the first point you start using an author, you want to introduce that author, and then we know that from that point until you give a page number, what you're saying is coming from that author's source, right? And then you integrate the page numbers throughout as the information comes from different locations. You also use signal phrases to establish authority, right? So you can say David Chow, a noted sports psychologist, right? That enables you to establish the authority of the sources you're using. Usually, when you're introducing a summary or paraphrase, a long summary or a long paraphrase, you use the author's name in the very first sentence of that paragraph. If the whole paragraph is summarizing one source, as will be the case in the research review, right? Then you're going to use that signal phrase as part of the topic sentence. When you get to the long research paper, and the point of a paragraph is not necessarily a source, but a point you want to make using a source, then the author's name will probably come 2 or 3 sentences in. You'll establish the point you're making and then bring your author in later. Let's see, I want to show you a couple of other things. So you're integrating your source. Page 480, author's name is in the sentence, so we put just the page number in the parentheses. When the author's not named in the sentence, you put it in the parentheses there. So the situations where you bury the author, I call it burying the author's name in the parentheses. You do that when the author's not terribly important, you're just using them once. Their credibility isn't especially important, and maybe it's just one little statistic. The statistic is the important thing, not the author's name, right? And so that's where you would sort of bury the author's name. When you don't have an author, again, articulate it, or give the article title. And then there's a couple of other rules. Page number unknown. In addition to the MLA rules, there are 2 MLD rules. You know what an MLD rule is? It's a Mary Lynn Diggs rule. There are only 2. That's the good news. I follow the MLA rules for the most part. There are 2 things extra, that I want you to do. One is paragraph numbers. When you have a source that does not have page numbers, I want you to give the paragraph number. Too many of our electronic sources now don't have any page numbers, and you can't go back and double check for plagiarism if you don't know where in a 35-page article something was taken from, right? So page 482 has the example of how that would look. They actually say if a source has numbered paragraphs or sections, you give the paragraph number. I want you to number the paragraphs or sections if they don't, and it doesn't have page numbers. Most of your sources will have page numbers, especially if you get them as a PDF, right? But if you can't get it as a PDF, count paragraphs. Just, blindly number your paragraphs while you're watching a basketball game or something like that, and then you won't hate me too much for asking you to do that. And then when you're using the source, you'll know which paragraph it comes from. So that's one of the MLD rules. The other MLD rule is in the works cited, which has to do with requiring a URL. So we'll get into some, I'll show you some examples of the works cited entries, but the other MLD rule, just for consistency and getting it all out there right now, is that the book says if your instructor requires a URL for web sources, include the URL, and I do require you to use those. Now this is for true web sources, not ProQuest and EBSCOhost that have these really weird URLs that are like 3.5 pages long, you know what I mean? This is for freestanding websites. If it's on ProQuest, EBSCOhost, it's stable. It's not going anywhere. I don't need a URL. If it's from the web in general, then I do need a URL. And it is true that I could find the article simply by using the title, but sometimes these articles are online in different forms, and even sometimes different lengths, some with pictures and charts, some without. So I need the actual URL of the site that you're using. Okay? So those are the only two MLD rules. There's just two. I won't be any more nitpicky than that with that kind of issue. So in terms of the works cited pages, there are several sections that are worth thinking about separately. One is the author section. How do I handle the author? The next is, how do I handle the article if it's a small thing and something larger? And then the other part is, if it's an electronic source, how do I handle it? And in particular, you guys are going to use a lot of example 40, articles from a database. Our subscription databases, EBSCOhost, ProQuest, require you to use example 40. What's weird about that is if you go to example 40, page 507, first thing it says is, for an article retrieved from a database, first list the publication information for the article, see items 7 to 15. So you go to page 40, or to example 40, and it tells you to go back to example 7 to 15, and then come back here. Because everything is the same as if it were print, up through the page number, but instead of then having the word print, as I did on the examples I wrote on the board earlier, you have the database, the word web, the date of access, right? Everything else is the same, whether it's print or not print, except that sometimes you don't have a page number, so that's one other variation. How much of this is familiar? How many of you kind of understand it? Some and some not, right? This gets tricky, right? And that's okay. The reason we're doing this wonderfully simplistic first paper is so that you can get used to doing all this stuff. I don't want you to have to work on doing this stuff while you're trying to be creative and say something really complicated and thoughtful in an organized fashion that you come up with. I want you to have a cut and dried paper where you just summarize and evaluate 2 articles and slap a conclusion and intro on each side of it and practice this in the process, okay? We're going to talk more about all of these details. It looks kind of simple here, even to just kind of look at our shaded boxes and say, okay, I've got a book. But, you know, there's 6 different kinds of books that you might have. So tomorrow I'm going to bring in some samples and we're going to look at them and we'll try to figure out how do you match what you're holding in your hand or what you're seeing on the screen to the example in here, because that gets tricky as well. Questions about any of this before we dip really briefly back into the first assignment talk?
How come we didn't learn, I didn't learn that in 101, to just put the number 6 instead of chow when you're...
Well, your teacher may have emphasized using...
the MLA.
Well, we are using the MLA. Your teacher might have emphasized using the author name and page number here and didn't want to bother you with the variations, which is if you use the author's name in the sentence, you just need the page number. If you don't use the author's name in the sentence, you need the author's name in the parenthetical. this is one of the challenges. This is actually one of the challenges with English instruction in general, is that it is so complicated and there are so many rules that have exceptions that most teachers would rather simplify it than overwhelm you with the details, right? And this is one of the reasons why, it's like, wait, I learned how to write a research paper in high school, and we didn't talk about any of this. I learned how to write a research paper in 101. We didn't talk about any of this. It's because we don't want to overwhelm you with too much. But for good or bad, 102 is where we got to make sure you've got it all now, right? And so it is just that one step up, right? We're filling in the cracks. You understood that when you used a source, you had to cite it. You were never quite sure on what you need to put in the sentence and what you needed in the parenthetical citation. It's one of those little cracks that we're plastering over a little bit, one of those little potholes that we're filling in so it doesn't mess up your suspension. So, the research review assignment, again, just real quickly. You're going to summarize and evaluate 2 articles on your final research paper topic and develop a list of questions that require further consideration, investigation, argumentation. Again, it's structured in a simplistic way to allow you to refine the locating and documenting sources skill, the summarizing, paraphrasing, quoting, and citing skill, avoiding plagiarism, evaluating the credibility and claims of sources, and developing questions, right? That's a lot to do anyway, but at least the complexity of the paper is sufficiently low that you can focus on these other kinds of skills. And I do have here, step by step, if you want to think about your choice of topic. We're going to talk a lot about topics on Monday. By a week from tomorrow, you should have finalized that choice, but there's no reason you have to wait that long. If you're thinking about a topic and you want to email me and bounce it off me, I'm happy to give you some feedback on it and help you with it, and then you're that much further ahead in this process. We're going to do some searches, and I'll show you how to be really efficient with that next week. You're going to have 2 articles for this paper. One of them has to be a scholarly journal article. We'll talk a little bit more about how they differ tomorrow. You're going to read them for comprehension. You write an introduction and thesis. Remember that thesis can be really cut and dry. Remember, it's as the articles below indicate. Blah, 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 something. They all indicate something. And everyone can have the same structure. Again, we'll deal with more complex thesis statements in the next assignment. But at this stage, all you're doing is summarizing and evaluating. The article just needs to indicate that you're going to summarize and evaluate. Or the thesis just needs to indicate that you're going to summarize and evaluate 2 sources. Yeah?
So you're really not using any ideas of your own? So you wouldn't state a personal thought on the 2 articles?
You could in the evaluation. But
Okay.
remember, you want to evaluate as objectively as possible. If you want to start raising questions that have to do with more your opinion on an issue, that might happen in the conclusion more.
Okay.
It can also happen in the evaluation. You can say, for example, this author claims one thing is true, however, I've always believed something else is true, and this makes me question his accuracy, right?
Yeah.
So you can do that kind of thing in your evaluation. But your thesis doesn't need to take a position. Your thesis will have to take a position in the subsequent assignments, but in this one, you're just sort of surveying the landscape still, right? So then you will summarize and evaluate. You're going to I want you to limit your use of quotations to 1 per article. There's a reason for this. I want you to get in the habit of putting things in your own words, right? Conclude with a paragraph of questions. Document using in-text citations, works cited format. We've got the basic structure outlined here for you. Some extra help in Rules for Writers with evaluating and summarizing, but we will be workshopping those components. Remember, we have 2 examples in here. We have the nurse shortage example, and we have the games example, the online role-playing games example. One thing to note with this is a newspaper article. F1 is page F1. That's actually the number of the page, right? So it's not footnote 1 or something weird like that. Notice they've used the paragraph numbers for sources that don't have them. I would go ahead and read both of these just to get a sense of what you have to do and kind of get the structure and simplicity in your head. In particular, you'll also notice that they introduce the article in the topic sentence because the whole paragraph is going to be about that article. You're going to summarize it, then you're going to evaluate it, right? And look at the kinds of questions they raise. A good 5 or 6 questions is a good number. 2 or 3 is kind of skimpy. You don't have to do it for 2.5 pages, right? 3 pages, you should be able to do the paper in 3 pages. Right? It's 2 to 3 page paper, plus the works cited. And we'll workshop all of those different parts. There's a checklist, you got the grade sheet for it, all that stuff is in the packet. And as I mentioned yesterday in the syllabus, we're going to be going through step by step. Once you guys have your topics, once you've got your articles, starting not next week, but the week after, 1 week before it's due, we're going to workshop the body paragraphs. We're going to workshop the evaluation. We're going to workshop the parenthetical and documentation stuff in class as a whole group. So we'll get volunteers. We'll put, this will be Kasim's paper up here, and we'll look at it. We'll see how he's doing with his in-text stuff. We'll make corrections for him. So you want to be prepared that day and volunteer, right? And then we'll have time for you guys to make corrections on your own as well. So I'm not going to just say, okay, you guys know how to do this now, do it. And we're going to go talk about a bunch of other things. We're going to be workshopping each part of this so that you get it in your sort of muscle memory, right? The muscle memory, just like when you're driving, there's a lot going on. We want you to be able to downshift into second gear, turn on your turn signal, go left, and switch back up to third, right? You need to be able to do that in this class. All right, I have held you over by about 30 seconds. My apologies. Feel free to blame it on me. I'll see you guys tomorrow.